Hello, and let's talk about the financial issues faced by states in dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, with Kerala as an example. It is almost universally acknowledged that Kerala has done a really good job in dealing with the crisis so far. It recorded the very first case of COVID-19 in India and saw cases in the hundreds. But a prompt governmental response and a cohesive social campaign have seen Kerala doing much better than other states which had a similar number of cases but have seen these numbers soar. It's worth noting that yesterday, Kerala recorded only one new case, and the total number of people who have recovered is 218. The state has the highest recovery rate in the country. Kerala has also won praise for the socio-economic measures it has taken to address some of the issues caused by the crisis. However, the question remains, where do states like Kerala raise the resources for such measures? Is the centre helping at all? How should the centre respond at a time when states are in the forefront of combating the pandemic? We talked to Kerala's Finance Minister, Thomas Isaac, on these issues. Here is what Dr. Thomas Isaac had to say. You mentioned in a tweet yesterday that the lockdown had to be extended, of course, there was no option. But there needs to be a very urgent action by the centre to ensure that states have much more funding. And we are at a time probably when the states are at a historical low, considering the flexibility they have in mobilizing resources and utilizing those resources. So could you tell us what exactly is the nature of challenges, for instance, Kerala is facing, and what the centre can exactly do right now?
We entered the current year under a cloud. Last year, the union government cut our market borrowing by about 1/3. Now, they seem to argue that in 2016-17, our public account borrowing was much higher than that we had said. Our counter argument has been that is nothing but our department's own treasury deposits. The reason being that because of financial stringency, we couldn't pay it out of the treasury ways and means restriction. Therefore, they were deposited in the treasury itself. But anyway, the outcome has been they cut our public borrowing. And on top of that, GST compensation arrears. And therefore, we are forced to push around 10,000 crores of rupees of last year's expenditure into the current year, bill spending and so on. So it's a very bad situation. Now comes the COVID. Now, I'm convinced, we are convinced that we have to do a significant income transfer to the people. Just the people who are in the seat of power, they should sit for 1 minute and think, what will they do if their salary was not paid? But on the other hand, very eminent people to think, don't they get food? This is not the food. Yeah, human beings need some money. And therefore, we are doing our best to have this income transfer, 8,500 rupees as welfare payments to 55 lakh people. All the rest of the workers, not pensioners, other workers, they're getting 1,000 rupees and so on. It's a very substantial income transfer within our limits. So to do that, we have been forced to front load our borrowing. We went for a 6,000 crores borrowing in the first auction. And strangely, we found the banks were unwilling to lend. They're putting up prohibitive rate of interest. And repo rate is 4.4. They want 9% rate of interest, a 15-year-old bond. And that shows how when the credit market is freezing. Now this is the situation. Now what do you do? Now April, there is no income for any state government, you see. So state governments are taking 2 expenditure cuts. Salaries are being cut and many developmental schemes are cut. I think they are even squeezing the health budget. Now this is crazy. You force state governments who account for 60% of the overall government expenditure to reduce expenditure in times of a slump is crazy macroeconomics.
Right.
Therefore, I said, if you want this to succeed and the states to be in the front line of the struggle, they should think of transferring money to states.
Right.
Um, Otherwise, how do we govern? See, how do we pay the salaries, spend on the health expenditures are required, ensure minimum food to all those who are quarantined, and so on. So this is something they are blissfully, I don't know, they're ignoring.
Right.
And not a word. Only money that central government has given to the states as a whole is 7,000 crores of rupees. Additional money. They would say, we give you revenue deficit grant. These are all routine things. Whether it was COVID or not, that money should have come to states. But additional money given is just 7,000 crores rupees for all the states in India.
Right.
And therefore, this is a major lacuna. This has to be addressed.
So, in terms of policy, what are the measures that the center has to take right now? I mean, you mentioned, I think, printing of notes also as an option.
No, I am just saying, look at IMF, whose credentials we all know. And now even they are so taken aback at what is happening in the world. They want to have a major step up in the SDR allocation. And only reason why it is not being done is because Trump is sure to veto it. Okay. Nobody in the IMF is speaking about structural adjustment or conditions. Nothing. They are just because it is frightening what is happening in the global economy.
Right.
35% reduction in the production in the one quarter in USA, 30% in Britain is a frightening scenario. USA can print money and give it to all over the world. But rest of the world cannot print money like that. And therefore you need SDR. Look, the central government is not thinking even in the way this IMF is thinking here.
Right.
That's the tragedy. That's the tragedy. So central government seems to be saying, now we also don't have revenue, so how do we spend? Now, do you know what they are doing? Therefore, they don't have money, therefore they're not going to pay the MB development fund.
Right.
They are cutting expenditure. See, I don't know what is this macroeconomics that they're following, you see. This is the time you should give more money to the MP so that they understand the local situation in their district, in their constituency, we spend on health. Instead of that, that is being cut. And they are encouraging state governments to cut. So we are saying give up this obsession with numbers, fiscal deficit numbers and so on, which have no sanctity in economic theory.
Right.
The conversion number made. And therefore raise the fiscal deficit ceiling for the states. We have demanded 5, but at least 4% as many states. Let me tell you, all states in India, including BJP states, in fact, Bihar Finance Minister Sushil Kumar Modi gave a written note in the GST Council demanding this. So this is a unanimous demand of all states in India. Will center listen?
Right.
2, now in the present circumstances, banks are unwilling to. They are, I think, afraid. A kind of never unbelievable kind of liquidity preference. They want to hold on to money. One doesn't know what is going to collapse tomorrow. That's a signal they're sending. That's a signal they're sending. They want to hold on to money. And therefore, what should central government do? Don't push states into the hands of the banks now. For the simple reason, I am paying 9% interest when my GDP growth is going to be minus. Now, this is the surest way of pushing all the states in India into a debt trap, a financial crisis. When by the time we get out of COVID, maybe 6 months from now or so, whatever time, all the states will be in serious financial crisis. Therefore, don't do that. Let central government borrow from the Reserve Bank.
Right.
I said print money, and ignorant guys. I mean, particularly the Sanghis, they have organized a big drive. On social media drive, there is a crazy fellow saying print money. Luckily for me, now Everybody says print money. I think they should do that.
Right.
Second would be pay our GST compensation.
Exactly.
Now, if you add April also, I think GST compensation out to states would come to something of the order 60,000 crores of rupees. Pay that money. This is something they cannot dot. They have to pay any day. If not today, tomorrow. So pay it today when the need is there.
In our next issue, we look at a decision by US President Donald Trump to cut funding for the World Health Organization. What is the impact likely to be on the WHO? And how are these funds used anyway? We talked to Dr. T. Sundararaman, the global coordinator of the People's Health Movement, on this issue. Listen to him. Thank you so much, Dr. Sundararaman, for joining us. So, the first thing we wanted to know was, of course, we've seen the political aspect of it. Trump has been trying to find a scapegoat. He's blamed China. He's blamed the WHO. He had threatened last week that he would withdraw, and finally 2 days ago he did withdraw support to WHO, that is. But in technical terms for the World Health Organization, what does a funding cut of this size and at this point of time mean?
It is a serious setback because many of the WHO funds are tied funds.
Right.
They can't use that very liberally. When emergency arises, and much of their core works out of something called the CES funds, where each nation which is a member pays something in proportion to its GDP.
Right.
So, not surprisingly, the largest single donor will be the US. The US has already got arrears, even before it has the tune of $200 million. And it has chosen from the 1980s, mid-1980s, to freeze its contribution.
Right.
Initially, or to a percentage, and then later in nominal terms also, so that it pays the same amount instead of letting it float with the GDP. So therefore, the US instead of paying as part of the CES, it moves its contribution to what are called voluntary donations, which are basically bilateral agreements, which are signed with WHO, which are very project specific and very clearly earmarked, so that it, in effect, doesn't allow WHO autonomy on using its funds.
Right.
That means the WHO has to depend increasingly on what are called voluntary donations with nations and with corporate philanthropies like the Gates Foundation, and with global health institutions which have corporate agencies on their board.
Right.
Now, the nature of a voluntary contribution is in the nature of a bilateral agreement, where the organization has to negotiate what deliverable it has. It's more like a project. In effect, it means the autonomy of the WHO to spend that money on its sense of priorities is completely abridged, and there are certain vertical programs that they each choose to focus on.
Right.
It also means that in a number of systems development areas, the WHO will be subcritical in its functioning. Now, as it stands, the US and its allies, especially in the developed world, through not only mechanisms of funding but mechanisms of bilateral negotiation, and by its overall influence, dominate every key appointment and decision making. All the resolutions are vetted by it. And therefore, it is very surprising for them to actually be seen as having been not supporting them enough.
Right.
The point is that currently there is a great perception of threat within the US with respect to its own rather poor performance, which is now being increasingly compared to China, much to its own.
Right.
So whereas we have now exceeded in deaths and in number of cases far beyond the Chinese, they need to now point fingers and say, no, the Chinese underreported. They may have, they may not have. That's beyond the point. But it's really not in WHO's remit. Does the WHO stand guarantee to the US figures or the India figures or the figures of any country? It's not within its scope. There is a diplomatic protocol.
Right.
It can persuade, it can negotiate. It is not like the IAEA, the Atomic Energy Regulation, that it can go in and command inspection and demand papers. It has to go by the record that are submitted. But in terms of its international commitments, it had raised it to a global pandemic by January 30th. It had already called upon isolation and identification and contact tracing as mandatory requirements. Now, remember, if you actually freeze international contact travel, then there are huge economic implications, and countries do not like that being done easily, nor is it necessary unless you are unable to restrict flow from a particular country.
Right.
You have no visa, for example. Otherwise, and WHO has sort of quietly maintained it, even as compared to lockdowns, what are really required is the process of identifying, of quarantining, of contact tracing. These are what is really going to sustain you in the long level. Anytime now, international travel will restart, and with it, when it restarts, the virus will restart.
Right.
The world has lived with yellow fever for years. It has lived with Zika virus. It has lived with Ebola. We don't have to have complete cessation of international travel.
Right.
This is a new virus, but precautions are needed, and to that extent, the WHO had warned. So I don't think the WHO can be faulted on its performance. What is really there is a delayed response from the US
Right.
in starting up testing, in starting up contact tracing, in being serious to the thing. They first started with suspending flights, but even after that, more than 3,000 flights have come in from China.
Right.
And that was anyway not the main way. Trump himself came to India on February 24th. He had a major event over here with lakhs of people attended. So obviously, that sense that you need an international travel restriction had not happened at that time.
Right.
And it's not anybody's particular fault, because the focus of the epidemic had anyway shifted to Europe by then. China, even China's distant provinces, have not really gone into the epidemic. The epidemic has been largely confined in the Hubei province. So it was what measures were taken are adequate as of date.
Right. So to continue a bit more on the WHO aspect itself. So you mentioned about how, say, the funding has now been connected to certain programs and certain verticals, and how it's very almost corporate in terms of deliverables, in terms of performance measurement metrics and issues like that. So what is the more problematic aspect of this kind of a model of working when you keep, say, public health as a concept on the other side?
Essentially, that your autonomy in terms of prioritization, in terms of being able to build capacities of member states, of being able to support a higher degree of self-reliance is abridged. You are not able to work within a health systems understanding rather than a vertical understanding. So you have the GFATM will support your interventions in tuberculosis and HIV. But when it comes to larger disease surveillance, for example, that sort of support is not forthcoming, and this is within that sort of area.
Right.
Or if you are supporting nations to be more self-reliant in essential health commodities, the WHO is not in much of a position to do that. It has done some important work in pooling of, for example, for flu pandemics to create a patent pool. It has taken such measures.
Right.
But those are precisely the measures. So behind the US current insistence is also that potentially as the US overcomes the hump, the developing nations are going to need a lot of the supplies, and other than China, the next big supplier is the US. And at some point, the building of US monopoly in testing kits and in vaccines and in ventilators are things that we need to worry about. A lot of patents have been released for 3M on the ventilator side. A lot of patents have been released on the testing kit side. Now, at some point, whereas the WHO is going with the Costa Rican proposal for patent pooling, for being able to have a pooled resource, these areas of the future play out of COVID-19 and corporate profits may be some of the concerns. So it may not just be anger and distraction.
Right.
It may also be an attempt to monopolize the global supply chain in a post-COVID-19 pandemic phase.
Right.
and also question the authority of the Chinese, who are now in effect commanding 80% of the supplies. I'm saying roughly. For example, almost all the supplies of PPEs, testing kits, the orders that we have placed are gone to China.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sundararaman, for talking to us. That's all we have today in this episode of Let's Talk. We'll be back tomorrow with the latest news developments of the day. Until then, keep watching NewsClick.